My name is Daniel Birnbaum. I'm an art critic and a curator, and I have been involved with many museums, and now I'm here as one of the curators of this exhibition by Gilbert and George. And it's, I think, the first time that we try to look at the entire oeuvre of Gilbert and George. There has been big exhibitions with these very well-known artists before, but this is a survey. It's a kind of a retrospective, not in an academic strict sense, but we actually look back at half a century of art. Gilbert and George got together as fellow students at St. Martin's School in London in the late 1960s, and they became a couple, both in life and in art. And it's a kind of unique story, I think, with two artists who have been living together, sharing everything, sharing life, and sharing art like this. And in a way, people often ask, what is their art about? And it's not so easy to answer that question, but I would ultimately say it's about the life of Gilbert and George. And not only the life of Gilbert and George, but actually life of human beings in general. So it's a prism. They are the prism, or the kind of microscope, perhaps, or microcosm, through which civilizations become visible. And there's nothing human that is foreign to Gilbert and George. The biggest of themes: politics, religions, sexuality, greed, money, death, life. It's all in there, but it's all seen through their eyes and experienced through them as human beings in flesh and blood. They have been good at that, actually, to really reach big audiences, and I think it's been their wish from the very beginning not to be reduced to the smaller conversations that sometimes take place in the kind of elite part of the art world, let's say, the most intellectual parts. I mean, they're there too. They are pioneers of some sort of, not performance art is maybe the wrong word, but they turn themselves, they turn their own bodies and their own lives into art, and that is, something that one really would find. There are a few other artists who at the same period were trying these, to maybe question and blur the distinctions between life and art. I mean, they're part of movements inside the art world, no doubt, but at the same time it's been very important for them that they want to reach everyone. Art for all was a slogan that they formulated early on, and it's maybe not everyone in the entire world who loves their art, but they reach a lot of people. And it's actually interesting also that they have been influential, not only in the sense that younger artists look at their work. They have reached outside of the art world. I mean, really into popular culture. They find inspiration in things that are outside of the art world, definitely, maybe more so than from other contemporary artists. But it's interesting to see that they have been, that one can find reflections inside the music world. I mean, everything from Kraftwerk all the way up to certain synth duos in England, I would say, would not exactly have looked the same without Gilbert and George. And it's interesting that they're also visible in other parts of the world. They are very much Western artists based in London, but at the same time their themes seem to be universal enough to work in Russia or Asia or Latin America, everywhere. So, I mean, there are very few artists who reach audiences like this. They are, I don't want to say unique, but they are unusual in the sense that they, in a way, staged themselves. I mean, they turned themselves into art. And early on, when they were really outsiders in the sense that, George doesn't come from, an art background. He comes from a working class background, not from London. And Gilbert doesn't even come from London. He comes from North Italy and came as a student to London. And they were very poor. I mean, they never make a secret out of that, background, that they had nothing. Many other of their fellow students came from a background where they could feel a little bit more secure. And so all they had was themselves and the streets of London. And they always liked walking the streets of London. They told me that sometimes they just take a bus to the last stop and walk home. And that's just, a way to get to know a city, and as we all know, London is an unbelievably rich and wonderful and strange and also sometimes horrible city, but it's so rich and they know every street, they know every little mews, every little corner, and they turn their own lives and their own bodies, but they also put on this professional shield, as they call it, and they decided to be professionals, and they dress up as young bankers. Now no longer so young, but when they started, they were, very civilized, very orderly, very normal looking, and it's a kind of a more radical gesture somehow, because one doesn't expect that from a kind of avant-garde art duo. So, one of their favorite writer, Michael Bracewell, who has written books about them and many, many catalog essays and actually wonderful essays, they have said, he has written that they look like conservatives gone mad, or bankers who kind of lost it and went nuts or something. And that's a little bit true, that they are not exactly normal in what they're performing in their pictures, and it became more and more extreme. As I said, nothing human is foreign, so why would we be ashamed of the fact that we are naked under our clothes? So why would we be ashamed of our sexuality or of our bodily fluids and excrements, anything? It's not only to shock. There's maybe an element of provocation occasionally in Gilbert and George's work, but it's actually also to embrace what it is to be human. It started out with them as two people who are artists and whose art is them. We are it, they realized at some point. So it started out with them performing everyday things, like walking through the city, sending letters, inviting one person to a meal. That person happened to be a very well-known artist who they liked and who was already quite world famous, David Hockney. But they turned everyday practices into an art form. And the most famous and influential, I think, of those early works is the piece called Singing Sculptures, where they performed a song. Occasionally they do that, and that's one of the sad things with them not being able to come here to Reykjavík, because something is, of course, missing when they're not here. Because they are the art, and one actually realizes that when they're standing in the middle of the exhibition and everything is reflected, their cosmos of images is somehow also always comes back to them, and then they occasionally actually re-perform, so to say. They perform this singing sculpture moment that which is now already more than half a century old. But at some point they also realized that one can represent, or one can create images, and they didn't really want to be painters, or they didn't want to be sculptors in the traditional sense, because they were the sculptors. They were the sculptors and the sculptures. I mean, they were themselves the artworks, but they documented them photographically. And early on, it was a black and white world, and rather modest in size, and often quite melancholic-looking pictures. We have some of them here from the early 1970s. And, step by step, this world grew, and there are so many chapters now that it's almost impossible to summarize their entire production, or what we actually try to kind of get a glimpse of in this exhibition. But the recurring format is this grid of photographs, and the grid is there from the very beginning, but originally they're small black and white photos. They become more and more lurid. For a little while it's one color that is introduced, so black and white and red, and then at some point they are like a kind of firework of colors, and it becomes very poppy and very kind of very flamboyant art, and in a way very it's like a kaleidoscope of visual possibilities, and very, very, very colorful. So it is a version of Gilbert and George in their entirety. They've been working for 50 years plus, Most of their work, or almost all of their work, actually reflects what they experience on their daily walks through London. They have lived together in the same building in East London, and they encounter the whole world in their streets. So it's an interesting world, I would say, because it's very British, it's very London-based. I mean, or rather, it's produced in London, and one feels that it's very much London. But it's also a part of a global city where all religions are present and have been present, where the worst and the best parts of mankind are very present around the corner, and you can find, signs of terrorism and violence and political radicalism and all these things in the streets, if you look at stickers and graffiti and everything. So in a way, it's really the global world seen through London, through the eyes of Gilbert and George. And, this, of course, is not possible because they have been working for so long that one cannot show everything they've done. But we have, this is an attempt to look at, half a century of work. And it's not a chronological exhibition. You cannot understand everything from day one to today. It's more of a kaleidoscopic exhibition, that every room has pieces from different decades, and recurring themes can be noticed. It is about the big tragedies and the most wonderful parts of being alive, from love and sexuality and magical thinking to violence and oppression. And it's, I think, an important exhibition. It's interesting to see the show traveling. This is not the last stop. We will, hopefully show it in Germany and maybe in Italy and in a few other places. But it is actually a unique exhibition, and I like this one very much. It's dense and full of the rooms are packed full in an interesting way. And I like the installation. I know Gilbert and George have produced a small miniature of these rooms in their studio, so they have been working on this for quite a while, even if they were only here briefly. There are periods that I like more than others, and there are individual works that I love and others who I don't care as much about, but I think it's all in here, and I like the early melancholic black and white photos very, very much. And I also like when one sees that Gilbert and George is part of a ecstatic, cosmological British tradition where one can find William Blake or other such people. They are cosmic artists. They're not only politically relevant artists of today. They stand in a very rich tradition.